I would like to show you one of my recent works in which I had to use Hollywood strings and share some tips and general information about this product, which is not the easiest library to use. You just heard a segment of a piece I had to do for a desert setting on an action RPG. I had very limited time to write two pieces like this, 60 seconds long each, so I also had to simplify the overall process in order to deliver the pieces on time. I will also share some tips in order to achieve that. The first thing I will recommend if you want to work quickly is to think about the time you will need to spend programming and to keep that in mind when composing. By that, I mean to think about the time you will be working with different key switches or expression maps, playing with the CC information and all that. You might want to write, for example, a melodic line with some long notes, then a few short staccato notes, then a few pizzicato notes in between, then get back to long notes and then a few spiccato notes, all with varying dynamics and levels of vibrato for each note. That's all fine, and modern libraries offer you all the tools to achieve that, but you have to keep in mind that this will necessarily take time to program. If you are on a very tight deadline, my first advice is to limit the amount of different articulations you are going to use on each instrument, and especially avoid having articulation changes too often during the piece. Having a definite segment for long legato notes and then a definite segment for staccato notes should be fine, but having more complex lines with a few notes of each will force you to spend much more time manually micro-adjusting note lengths and properly setting the articulations on the key switches, expression maps, or separating the line to different channels. You will also spend time zooming in and out a lot, which also adds up. Let's start with the violins, which are the main melodic force in this segment. This is how they look after some work. And here's how they looked just after importing the MIDI I composed in Finale. You can see I just doubled the melody an octave apart. This can be a very effective or lazy procedure. In this case, I only doubled it once, but some people do the same with the violas and even the cellos, and play the melody on 3 or 4 octaves. You can experiment with that if you think it will help your composition. You can see this segment has only long legato notes, which is something I did on purpose to save on programming time. I usually like to use staccato notes among long notes on melodies, but as I had to deliver this so quickly, I decided to have definite segments for different articulations. This is the score. Here are some long notes, and here are some staccato notes on a different section. So, you can see that the notes are placed exactly right on time on the timeline when you just import the MIDI. This is a problem. I will unmute the percussions as well so you can hear it. Now, here the end result again. As you can tell, the notes sound completely out of time on the first example. This is because of the way this particular legato program works. So, let's look at that now. This program is called First Violins Leg Slur plus Port LT 12 Ni, which means First Violins Legato Slur plus Portamento Light 12 Niente, and it's just one of many legato programs available in this library. This is a quick tutorial, so I'm not going to explain all the different programs and the nomenclature. That's all detailed in the manual. I use this particular program very often, and you can use it to learn while following this tutorial. This program lets you control the speed of the transition between the notes, from a quick legato to a very slow and pronounced portamento. Let's hear some examples. Here we have the melodic line from earlier. Let's hear it with a standard legato for all the transitions. Now, let's hear the same line with all the transitions being portamento, which means a slower and more pronounced legato. Now, let's hear the line again with all the transitions being somewhere in the middle between a quick legato and slow portamento. These effects are not achieved by MIDI pitch shifting, but by what East-West calls true legato. In the case of this particular program, as you could probably see in the examples, the different levels of legato are determined by the velocity information on the second note. Highest velocity will trigger a more disconnected legato sample. Lower velocity triggers a more connected sample, and the lower you go in velocity, the slower and more pronounced the legato effect will be, getting to a very slow and pronounced portamento effect on the lowest velocities. The shift from slur to portamento happens at number 51 in the velocity controller line. 50 or lower will be portamento. 51 and above will be slur, which means a quicker transition than portamento. Now you probably understand why the notes sounded out of time when they were placed exactly on time on the timeline. When the second note starts, only then the legato effect or transition starts. This transition takes some time. During this short time, nor the first note nor the second one are completely defined. So, in order to make the second note land on time, we have to compensate for this and place the start of the second note a bit earlier. The exact amount you are going to have to move the notes will depend on the tempo of the piece and what kind of legato you are using. You will get there just by trial and error. Keep in mind that there has to be some overlap for the legato samples to be triggered, but the amount of overlap doesn't matter. If there is no overlap, both notes will sound completely detached. Another thing to consider is that the first note on a line, because it's not connected to another one before it, doesn't need to be moved. It will start on time. However, to make it sound more natural, we will probably want to move it too. We will talk about that later. By the way, I have been talking about moving notes, but you can see I actually resize them. This is so I don't accidentally change the pitch or necessarily change the position of the end of the note. You can move them or resize them, that's up to you. So, we were talking about legato, portamento, and how connected notes will need to be moved or resized around. As a first step, I will take all the notes except the first one and resize them all together to place their starting points a bit earlier in the timeline. I mostly want these notes to have a pronounced legato, so I will also take all their dynamics and lower them to about 70. Cubase lets me do that by clicking on this little square and lowering the mouse position. This is just a starting point. Now we will have to hear and adjust every note until we are happy with the sound. So, I really want this interval to be played portamento and to have a more pronounced effect than the rest, so I will lower the velocity here. Now, you need to keep hearing the line and modify the velocity of the intervals you want to have a more or less pronounced transition. You might need to micro-adjust some note lengths that might be coming a bit late now. You have to keep doing this until you are happy with the sound. There is no right or wrong in this, it's mostly based on taste. You can see I prefer slower transitions on bigger intervals, and that I tend to go for quicker transitions on faster segments. Now we have a decent sounding line already, but there's more to do. Let's focus on expression now. We know that velocity affects the legato or transition effect and has nothing to do with dynamics. In the case of this program, dynamics are controlled with CC11 or expression. It's very simple. Higher CC11 information means higher dynamic or forte, and lower CC11 information means lower dynamic or piano. This affects the actual sound of the instrument, not only the amplitude or volume. So, controlling CC11 is not like just controlling the volume knob. You can crossfade between different dynamics by having gradual increments in the CC11 controller lane. You can do the same with vibrato intensity on CC1. This means you can start a note on pianissimo and gradually get to fortissimo in a seamless way, just like a real violin section will do. Now, Let's get back to the melodic line we were working on earlier, and let's focus on the first note. You can hear the beginning sounds very sudden or abrupt. You might want it to sound like that, but in this case I would like a more subtle start, so I will use CC11 to achieve that. I will resize the note and place its start a bit earlier. Now I will have the expression information go from 0 to about 100 very quickly. This will produce a more subtle and less abrupt start of the note. Let's hear the melodic line now with the percussions. It sounds much better now. As I said in the beginning, in this case I just doubled the first and second violins an octave apart. So, because I'm working with equivalent programs for violins 1 and 2, by which I mean I am using programs that react in the same manner to velocity and CC11, I can just do the following, at least as a starting point. Just double the first violins line into a different channel for second violins and transpose it an octave lower. I'm doing this because I have already invested some time in the first violins by resizing notes and working on the velocities and expressions, so I shouldn't need to start from 0 if I need a similar result on the second violins. This is just as a starting point, but usually you don't need to adjust much more if you did a good job on the first violins, unless you are going for a specific sound in which you really want, for example, to have slow portamento on the first violins and completely disconnected notes on the second violins for a double line, which is not something I will do, personally. I need to mention that all of this information applies to this specific program, and that Hollywood Strings has many other programs that react different to some of this MIDI CC information. So, if you are working with a different program, don't expect these tips to work flawlessly. You need to read the manual and get to know the specific program you are going to use. Now we have a decent sounding melodic line, double an octave apart. You can spend hours making it more realistic by being more detailed with expressions, but I think the concept is clear. Now, I only have the cheapest version of Hollywood Strings, which is included in the Composer Cloud, so I only have access to the mid and close microphones. I only have installed the mid microphone. It sounds good, but a bit dry, so I like to add some reverb. Let's go to the instrument track and add a reverb. Obviously, I'm going to use Spaces 2, which is also included in the Composer Cloud, and I will select my favorite preset for orchestral work here, which is found on the so-called Orchestral Hall folder. I really like these presets just as they are. It's not very pronounced, but it's beautiful and helps to mask or hide some shortcomings you might encounter when working with samples. These presets have two versions, one that says FR for front and another that says RR for rear. If you are only working in stereo like me, just choose the FR one. The rear ones are needed when you are working for surround sound and you need to deliver audio files with more than 2 channels. Spaces also has a manual that you should read, especially if you will need to deliver a file for 5.1 surround or above. Let's hear the results so far. I think this is enough information for a single video, so maybe in the future I can talk about the other string articulation such as staccato and pizzicato and other instruments. Recently, East West has announced an update to Hollywood Orchestra called Hollywood Orchestra Opus, so maybe in some time all this information will be obsolete, who knows. I only wish they include both changed samples in the Composer Cloud version.